Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Union, and in this one, the Russians have managed to advance in several sectors of the front line, including the northern section within the Kharkiv region, where the Russians have advanced both on the eastern and western banks of the Oskil River line. The Russians also managed to advance to the northwest of Lyman as they continued offensive operations to cut off the supplies towards the city. The Russians also managed to advance to the north of Chasiv Yar as they continued positional battles east of Sichneve for the operational encirclement of the city. The Russians also managed to advance in the Dnipropetrovsk region on the southeastern outskirts of it. The Ukrainians in turn managed to recapture some positions to the south of Marrinka in the Siversk section of the front line and to the east of Kupyansk in the Zaporizhzhia section of the front line. Starting out in the northern section of the front line on the western bank of the Oskil River line, the Russians have advanced to the west of Krasnoperche, where they've managed to gain control over additional forest patches here along the road. The Russians are here securing the western flank for the road, connecting the Russian forces on the western bank of the Oskil River line between Kupiansk and Siversk. The Russians have been launching offensive operations along these forest lines over the past few weeks, where they're looking to gain control over the positions east of this road that connects Kupiansk to Kupiansk and Siversk to Kupiansk. Russians are here looking to gain control over the border section between the Kharkiv and Belgorod regions, where the Russians are looking to gain control over the areas around Milove in the northern flank, down towards the roads connecting to Siversk in the south and Kupiansk in the east. Gaining control over this border area will allow the Russians to significantly increase the presence of their forces on the western bank of the Oskil River line for future offensive operations. The Russians have generally been launching a lot of operations in the entire front line to prepare for an offensive operations. They are shaping the battlefields to gain advantageous positions where they can concentrate larger forces and also to dismantle the Ukrainian fortified positions, while also degrading the Ukrainian combat ability by attacking their positions. To the north of Kupiansk, the Russians advanced on the eastern bank of the Oskil River line, gaining control over the forest patch area here to the southwest of Sinkivka. Regaining control over this forest patch area allows the Russians to open the road for future offensive operations towards Kupiansk on the eastern bank of the Oskil River line. The Russians are continuing their offensive operations within the city itself to gain full control of it. The efforts on both banks of the Oskil River line is to gain control over Kupyansk, which will allow them to cut off the supplies for the Ukrainian forces in the eastern bank of the river line in this section of the front line. There is still another crossing through the bridges that have been blown here in the direction of Kupyansk-Vuhledar. However, the Ukrainians are mainly using pontoon bridges from across the Oskil River line. However, with Kupiansk under their control, the Russians will be able to concentrate a large concentration of forces, especially with the recent advances to the east of Kupiansk along the highway. If they're able to gain control over the highway, they'll be able to concentrate a significant amount of forces in the Kupiansk direction to gain control over the eastern bank of the Oskil River line and to launch offensive operations staged from Kupiansk itself on the western bank of the Oskil River line, and also to concentrate their forces further south in the direction of Borova and Lyman. Speaking of Lyman, the Russians managed to advance to the north of Lyman. Following the capture of the fortified positions southwest of Vuhledar, the Russians are expanding their offensive operations along the forest patches and the forest lines to the east of Rylovye. The Russians are slowly advancing along these forest lines to reach Dobrysheve and the supply lines leading into Lyman from the northwestern direction, pushing through to gain control over Rylovye, Dobrysheve, Novoselivka, and Chernihiv will allow the Russians to cut off all supply lines connecting to Lyman in the northwestern direction, leaving the southeastern and southwestern roads as the only supply routes for the Ukrainian forces within the city. Both of these are located in frontline positions, where Siversk is directly at the front line, while Kupiansk is in the rear. It is still within close proximity to the front line. This will be the main supply route of the Ukrainian forces in the direction of Lyman, where the Russians will be looking to bypass the city from the south eastern direction and northwestern direction to reach the Siversk River line and cut off all supplies leading into the city while laying siege to it. The Russians are now just a few kilometers from the city, and the battle over the city will soon begin. To the east of Siversk, the Ukrainian counterattack towards Serbianka regained control over the fortifications just south of the settlement and gained a foothold in the southern outskirts of the settlement through the residential area. The Ukrainians are here looking to regain control over Serbianka, as Serbianka is a bridgehead for the Russian forces to start a siege over the fortifications on the northern flank of Siversk. Gaining control over these fortifications between Kupiansk and Serbianka and the northeastern flank of Siversk will allow the Russians to attack the town from the north. Combined with the recent advances to the south, the Russians could put the town itself in a pincer from the northern and southern flanks. The Ukrainians are proactively attempting to prevent this by counterattacking the northern flank of Siversk, regaining control over Serbianka, and the fortifications just east of Siversk will allow them to re-establish their defensive lines to the east of the town and prevent a Russian storming of the town from the northern and eastern directions. To the south of this and the northern flank of Chasiv Yar, the Russian Ministry of Defense report the capture of Markove. This is a very confusing report because this section of the front line generally has a somewhat reliable reporting from the Russian Ministry of Defense. However, this report is very confusing, and even the pro-Russian source who is in contact with Russian soldiers has left it as a gray zone rather than a Russian capture of it. The reason why this is so confusing is twofold. The first one is the lack of the capture of Maiske to the southern flank of Markove. Second part is the lack of capture of Novomarkove. Both of these not necessarily required to capture Markove, but would significantly lessen the burden of the Russian forces storming the settlements to do so. The reason for this is that there is the road directly connecting Maiske to Markove from the south, where there are several fortifications facing the eastern direction. That is because the Ukrainians have established defensive lines along the western bank of the canal to secure the canal itself. The Russian forces are present on the western bank of the canal following the capture of Chasiv Yar and have pushed further up towards the north, where they are within close proximity to the roads. So it is possible for the Russians to pass through the canal through pre-established crossing points, or by deploying new pontoon bridges, or simply crossing the canal itself, and then advance towards Markove, which would make sense through the roads to push towards the settlement, and the majority of these fortifications are towards the canal itself, which makes it difficult, but it is still possible for the Russians to do so. But this raises the question as to why they are bypassing Novomarkove and Maiske. In either case, if the Russians have gained control over Markove, then Maiske and Novomarkove are undefendable for the Ukrainian forces, and the Russians will quickly gain control over those settlements as well, gaining full control over the northern flank, which is required for the operational encirclement of Konstantinivka. If it is a fake report, then it hasn't happened, and that's that. So it'll be interesting to see over the coming days whether confirmation of this arrives. Moving on to the southern section of the front line, the Russians have managed to advance here to the west of Sichneve, gaining control over the settlement itself, the fortified positions in the vicinity of it, and reached the outskirts of Horoshe and Vorone from the northern direction. The Russians have managed to gain control over Novoselivka, following which they are able to flank Sichneve from the northern and southern directions, gain control over the fortifications and the settlement itself by cutting off the supplies that led into it. This forced the Ukrainian withdrawal to Vorone and Horoshe, where the Russians followed tightly behind with their own push, where the Russians are now fighting over the outskirts of Horoshe and Vorone, both of these settlements, on the northern flank of the second defensive line in the Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk regions. The Russians also continue offensive operations to the northwest of Klomochovacha to gain control over additional parts of the defensive line on the southern flank of Vorone. The Russians continue their offensive operations along the Oskil River line to secure the northern flank for the offensive operations to gain control over the defensive line, gain control over this pocket here with Berezove, Ternove, and Stepove, will allow the Russians to have additional settlements to concentrate their forces further from Velika Novosilka. And again, this section of the front line is poorly supplied for the Russian forces, where the nearest, largest logistical hub for the Russian forces is Velika Novosilka. Beyond that, there are not proper roads, there's no highways, there's no railways that the Russians can supply their forces through. Instead, they have to use trucks and light supplies as they get further and further from the city of Donetsk itself. However, with settlements such as Shevchenko, Vilnopole, and numerous other of these smaller settlements, the Russians are able to establish a dispersed and diversified area to which they can resupply their forces, meaning that they'll have a lot of smaller positions for logistics, which allows them to concentrate smaller groups, but a large number of them, allowing for larger concentrations in smaller pockets. Rather than one settlement with 100 soldiers, they have 10 settlements with 10 soldiers each. The effect this has on the front line is that the Russian forces are more dispersed, which means that there is more difficult time storming larger positions. However, the smaller positions such as Ternove, Beresove, Novoheorivka, these smaller settlements are still being captured by the Russian forces. However, if they were to storm a larger area such as Veliko Mikhailivka, it would be more difficult for the Russian forces. It is also difficult for them to establish defensive lines to deal with Ukrainian counterattacks. It means the areas that they capture can be recaptured by the Ukrainian forces, as they simply do not have the proper defensive positions to deflect these Ukrainian counterattacks. They're also more vulnerable to Ukrainian FPV drones once they are detected, but it is more difficult to detect them. The Ukrainians also managed to recapture some positions in the eastern parts of Melitokmashka. The Russians stormed Melitokmashka many months ago. Then we didn't really get any reports from the area. Now we're receiving new reports of the Russians storming the settlement, which shows that the Russians in this period of time between the last storming of the settlement with this new one have lost these positions here in the central parts along the prison area. With this, the Ukrainians continue their offensive operations to gain full control over the settlement, while the Russians are looking to establish their positions on the eastern flank, gain control over the prison area and the central parts along the school area to establish themselves properly within the settlement and continue onwards towards Oryhev. Combined with their recent advances towards Novodanilivka, the Russians continue their pressure on the eastern flank of Oryhev to reach the outskirts of Oryhev through the southern and eastern highways. Gain control over those, as well as Novoandrivka to the southwest, will allow the Russians to stage offensive operations towards Oryhev from 3 separate directions through several highways, which allow for stronger concentration of Russian forces, as they have a lot of settlements in the area where they can concentrate a lot of their forces, with one section of it being the main sections where combat operations are taking place. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.